Morning everyone. Hopefully you've made it okay to this video. Really hoping this video works. I'm sorry we're not sort of live Google meeting. It just doesn't seem to be coping with lots of students on at one time. I imagine half the country is using it right now. And if they're not, a huge portion of our school is. So it's not great. So what we'll do for the time being is I will still be live in Google Chat while you do things like watch this video, and I will voice over any slide sets I'm going to go through, etc. I'll also share these slides with you on Teamy, so you'll have access to them later. I imagine you'll want to go back and click through them a bit more slowly than I'm going to talk through them today. Okay, so let's get started. We're doing oligopolies, and so this is our third competition level, okay? We started with our perfectly competitive market, huge numbers of competition, sort of far end of the spectrum. We jumped all the way to the other end and looked at monopolies, and now we're going to work our way back towards perfect competition. So our oligopoly is one step down from our monopoly market, okay? At this point, we're starting to look at, say, 2 to 10 large organizations. There may be other firms in the industry, but they're small and have very little impact, as it were, okay? So let's get started. On this slide set, you'll see that I've got the key learning objectives. This is the whole section of oligopoly on here that you're looking at now. You don't need to memorize these, but you might want to use them as that checklist to sort of check your understanding. We're not going to get through all of these today. These are just kind of the starting point. So my goal for today is to kind of get to the end of interdependence, and we're going to talk a little bit about game theory, but we're not going to look at collusion today. There's some reading. The cognitive reading I've said at the end is about collusion, okay? So, as with all the other market structures, probably the key thing you want to focus on is how is this different from the other market structures, okay? Comparative questions are common and popular. So as we go through, I'll be telling you about the features of an oligopoly, and I'll just be highlighting how is it different. So, an oligopoly is an industry where you've got a significant concentration, okay, of power, market power, with just a few firms. So you remember I said it's kind of that 2 to 10 range, but there can be other firms, but they don't hold market influence, okay? They're small, insubstantial kind of players in the game, as it were, all right? So it's about the concentration being within that small number of firms. It doesn't mean there is only that number of firms in the market. That's probably something that confuses students. They go, oh, but, you know, this market has 20 different firms in it, but these 3 are the most influential. Well, then it may be an oligopoly, okay? So, as usual, there's a video here. If you want to watch it later just to refresh your understanding, add to it, feel free to do so. It's quite a nice summary of the characteristics we're going to talk about today, so you might want to go back and just reflect on those at some point later. So, what are the assumptions of this model, or the characteristics is another way of putting this slide, okay? An oligopoly, like I said, has a few large firms, so unlike perfect competition, where there's lots and lots of small firms, or a monopoly where there's one large firm, in an oligopolistic market, you've got a few large players, potentially lots of small players, but predominantly a few large ones. Much like a monopoly, there are significant barriers to entry, particularly to the level of market power point, okay? So it's not impossible to enter the market. That's why small players can kind of get in, but it's much harder to achieve kind of that dominance within the market. Now, that may be because of factors like high levels of brand loyalty in these industries. It can be because of economies of scale. It may be the type of industry where to really make big money and to be able to afford to have really good price competition and all of those other factors and to be innovative, you've got to be producing at scale. So you can enter as a small player, but you're not going to have that kind of level of influence. There's probably still some licensing restrictions potentially, or the capacity for copyright or patent use. So thinking technology industries is probably a good example of that. But if we move to the next point, unlike in our perfectly competitive market where everything was homogenous, or our monopoly where it's differentiated because it's the only firm producing, in an oligopoly, the product can be either. So oligopolies aren't always differentiated or always the same. So for example, if you look at something like OPEC, which is an oil oligopoly, okay, and OPEC specifically is sort of an example of collusion within that structure. Oil is oil fundamentally. I mean, there's some variability, but it's predominantly it's oil. So you've got quite a homogenous product there. Whereas alternatively, you might have something like, say, soft drink manufacturers where they're differentiating. They're producing something unique like Coke's secret recipe, for example, okay? And this homogeneity versus differentiation becomes important later when we start talking about the strategic thinking. The next thing you need to know about oligopolies is that they are massively interdependent. What that means is that if one firm changes its prices or changes its product or expands, other firms are going to be directly impacted by that. And they're going to have to respond. Like, I don't mean like, oh, I've lost a few customers and yeah, it's over. They're actually going to have to do something about that. And so it's something to be aware of when we talk about kind of interdependence, that one of the things a firm who is in an oligopoly market has to think about is, well, if my competitor does this, what will I do? Or if I do this, how will the competitor respond? And then what will I do? So there's a lot of kind of strategic thinking, which is our last feature. Oligopolies are massively long-term like planners. They're constantly thinking strategy and response. I do this, they'll do that, we'll do this, okay? And have to be prepared for that adaptability, because otherwise they can't maintain that dominance within that market. Now, these are just a few factors. I think the thing about oligopolies and monopolistic competition, which is the last level of competition we're going to talk about, they're slightly more blurry in terms of which industries fall into those categories, okay? They're not, you can't go, yet that's it. So with perfect competition, we know, like, it's got to have hundreds of firms, it's got to be perfectly homogenous product, it's got to be perfect information. With monopolies, it's got to be one firm that pretty much controls the whole industry or is the whole industry. Massive, they're easy to distinguish. When we get to oligopolies, those industries can look quite different. They can vary, which is why we start to look at ways we can more distinctly, I suppose, measure, which brings me to my next point, which is the concentration ratio. Now, you're looking at the concentration ratio on your screen now, hopefully, and you'll see that there's an image there. That image is also in your textbook if you want to go back and look at it later. But you'll notice that in that image, you can see all 4 levels of market competition. So the concentration ratio is not exclusively for oligopoly structures. It's just it becomes more useful when we start to try and determine what is an oligopoly structure. So the concentration ratio is basically a way that we've attempted to measure the degree of market power that a firm has, or several firms have. So if we take a sample of firms, usually the most powerful or most dominant firms within a given industry, and you can set the number of firms you want to take as the sample, but kind of the industry standard for a concentration ratio is the top 4. Don't know why I did 3 then. The top 4 firms. And then we look at how much dominance those firms have. And we calculate that dominance as a percentage. And then we use that percentage to determine what level of competition do we then perceive. So if you measure an industry and you take the top 4 most powerful firms in that industry, and it turns out that they have a concentration ratio level of, say, 70%, that tells you it's probably an oligopolistic market. Okay, if you look at that scale, our mountain there, anything between about 50 and 80 tells you it's an oligopoly. Now, it's not the only factor. So let's say we were a bit lower. Let's say we were at, say, 60%. At that point, it might be monopolistic competition depending on what other features of the industry exist, okay? How many players are there in that market? Is the product always differentiated? That might indicate that it's not so much an oligopoly. So at that point, you can kind of start to look at it, but the concentration ratio gives us a starting point, okay? So just a different way to look at that. You're now looking at kind of a scale across your screen. It's a bit bigger, sampled on having like the market share of the largest 4 firms, okay? So CR4 would equal 70%. It's an oligopoly. I'll give you a minute to look at that. Okay, so at this point, I'd like you to pause the video on your screen and just go away and do a little bit of Googling for me, okay? I want you to do some research and see if you can find examples of industries with high concentration ratios. And make a few notes. Think about things like what kind of industry is it, roughly how many firms are in that industry, who are the top 4 firms, and what do we think the concentration ratio is. You'd be surprised how much information you can find. And what I want you to do is after you've done that and you've gone and looked, I'd like you to post just one example each. Everybody can do this as a comment on today's task post for me. So the video, pause it, head off to look at examples, and then you can come back and see me. So hopefully you looked at the examples. If you didn't, I assume you're planning to go and do that at the end of this video. We're going to just talk a little bit now about that idea of mutual interdependence. I said at the start that a feature of oligopolies is that if one business changes something, the others are going to be affected. And this is because there is such a tiny number of firms. So in terms of a competitive market, if you think about it like this, if you're a consumer and you're looking at a market of 100 options, 200 options, it's hard to keep track of what everybody's doing. So you tend to be influenced by geography, who your kind of main regional marketing vision is, brand loyalty, things like that. In an oligopoly, things like brand loyalty still have a part to play, but because there are so few firms, it's now also much easier for me as a consumer to compare you. So if Apple drop their phone prices, I'm going to now look at Samsung and be like, well, hello, come on, what are you doing? If Huawei come out with a new product, I'm now going, well, why aren't you guys developing this camera technology? And we see that all the time. And so every time a firm makes a change, we as an industry now need to respond to that change. Now, I know you can't see the little bit of text under where my video is playing. That's okay. You can look at the slides later. But it's basically telling you that this interdependence, this mutual need to kind of bounce off each other is pretty unique to an oligopoly. So you remember I said that there are a range of factors we'll be looking for, concentration ratio being one. This interdependence is another. So you won't see this level of interdependence in monopolistic competition, for example. You won't see this response rate occurring. It's pretty unique to this level of market competition. So, going to get you to pause the video again, and I just want you to take a minute, and you can Google or just have a brainstorm and think of industries you're familiar with where there are examples of firms' decision-making being influenced by other firms, okay, or by considering what other firms might be going to do. So thinking along the lines of, you know, think about how tech companies release new tech on a cycle and how closely it's released. A current one I'm following at the moment is there's a new PS5 coming out, they think at Christmas, but there's also a new Xbox coming out, also possibly at Christmas. And this has been really strategically done because the market for gaming machines or game consoles is really small, okay? And the two big players in that game are obviously having to watch each other to make sure one doesn't kind of outbeat the other with new products. So take a minute and just have a think. You don't have to post this anywhere. Just pause the video, have a think, maybe add the examples to your notes if you think of them though. And then come back and see me again. So the last kind of point I want to talk about with regards to mutual interdependence is that because of this interdependence, firms have to think strategically. They have to think, what's the next reaction going to be from me and from my competitors? If I do A, what will they do? If I do B, what will they do? And if they do this, what will I do in return? Okay. And so what this means for firms in these industries is that they kind of have at the start, or as they're developing, two options available to them. Option one, compete. So constantly play the strategy game and hope to win. You know, beat them to the market with your next product, outprice them, build better brand loyalty. Just constantly stay ahead in that game. The other alternative is to collude. Now, some of you may be familiar with the term collusion, or you'll have heard it in mainstream media. And some of you may be at this point thinking, I thought it was illegal. Formal collusion in most countries is illegal, and we will talk a bit more about that in your next lesson. But basically, collusion is the practice of either working with another company formally or informally to make decisions. So the formal version is pretty straightforward. You sit down with your competitor and you go, hi, yeah, you know what? Let's raise our prices by 10%. We'll both agree to do that. Let's do it. Informal collusion tends to result when you've got a kind of one market leader who's just above the head of the pack with the rest regards to dominance, and they make a change and everybody always follows. So their prices go up by 10% and everybody else's prices go up by 10%. And they just kind of follow along with that process. Now, we are going to talk a little bit more about that, but before we kind of get into collusion, what this kind of strategic thinking then requires of the firm is that they think about or work out how they're going to determine the other company's response. And this is true whether you're competing or colluding, because you have to factor in, are they going to honor their agreements? Are they going to respond ethically? Are they going to respond in my interests? Remember, each firm is trying to profit maximize. They're trying to get the most customers. So everybody's kind of playing for themselves, and you have to work out whether you can trust the information that you're receiving. And this is where game theory starts to become important. And what you're going to do today is you're going to do a bit of reading on Cognity after this video, looking at game theory and looking at collusion. But game theory is basically a mathematical proof, as it were, or a system that allows us to consider how two parties in a mutually potentially beneficial situation might respond according to the conditions available to them. Now, the other way we can look at game theory is through something called prisoner's dilemma. Some of you will have heard prisoner's dilemma before. If you do psychology, you might have talked about this. I'm not sure if you've done that yet. You will if you haven't already. And the basic premise here is really simple. You've got two prisoners, okay? Imagine they're in the cells next to each other. And the cops want them to spill on each other, and they're told, if you spill on your neighbor, you tell us everything they did that they told you, okay, we're going to let you out tomorrow. And they tell the other guy the same thing. So at this point, they're sitting there going, well, that's a good deal. Like, I can guarantee to get off this charge if I dob on him. But the problem with this is if you tell and they tell, you both end up in jail for 10 years. So far we've got two options before us. We have the option of get out of jail free card for one party if the other party doesn't dob, or 10 years in jail if you both dob. Or you can collude. You can talk through the bars and you can agree that neither of you will talk. And there's enough evidence to put you away for a charge that's a bit lesser, so you might spend 5 years in jail. So if you collude, you guarantee to spend 5 years. If you cheat, so if you tell them you're going to collude and then dob them in, you might get 0 years, but you also might get 10 if they also cheat. And this is the prisoner's dilemma or game theory. This is where they then have to think about what's in their best interest. And to help judge this, we need to know things like how risk averse are the parties, what have they previously done that might indicate where their behavior is going. And this is kind of the same situation for two oligopolistic firms or a group of oligopolistic firms trying to decide, will they collude? If you think of it like this, if we sit down, we'll both agree to raise our prices by 20%. But one of us is going to ignore that and leave them where they are. You've gone and raised your prices, and now I'm making more money because all your customers have come to me. Okay, that's the risk. But if you both raise your prices, you both make a bit more money, but you keep the customers you've already got. Okay, so you could make overall more money by cheating, but you also risk losing everything. Okay, including losing the agreement that you've had. So that's just a concept I wanted to introduce today. I know the video is not showing that. There will be slides on that with collusion when we talk about it next lesson. I'm now going to leave you to your couple of questions I want you to try, as well as the reading if you want to pre-read for our next class where we're going to talk about collusion. If you have any questions, I will be live on chat throughout this session. Have fun.